Hello, everyone. Welcome to Conservation International's webinar entitled Financing Biodiversity, Commitments Since COP15 and the Path Ahead. We're delighted to have you with us today. My name is Kristen Miller, and I'm the Manager of Special Events at Conservation International. Before I introduce our host and moderator of today's discussion, I want to cover a few housekeeping items to ensure this event runs smoothly. Upon joining, all attendees will be muted automatically, and your camera will be turned off and remain off for the duration of the event. In the interest of time, we've disabled the chat function, but we hope that this conversation will be a starting point for future engagements on the importance of financing for biodiversity. If you would like to listen to this webinar in Spanish, please click Interpretation from the toolbar along the bottom of your screen and select Spanish from the dropdown. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded and will be sent to all attendees after the presentation. It is now my honor to introduce our host and moderator, Carlos Correa. Carlos is Colombia's former Minister of the Environment and is currently a Lui-Walton Senior Fellow at Conservation International. Carlos provides strategic counsel to CI's leadership on institutional priorities around topics such as natural climate solutions, ocean conservation at scale, and nature-positive economies through a just and inclusive approach. Thank you so much for leading us today, Carlos.
Well, thank you very much, Christine. Hello, everyone.
So whatever works best for you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where in the world you are. We are gathered today to talk about the progress we have made on financing biodiversity commitments following the historic Global Biodiversity Framework, or the GBF, and the long road ahead to scale up finance for nature and bridge the $700 billion funding gap. 2022 was an unprecedented year in terms of momentum for both climate and biodiversity finance. The creation of the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund calls for reforming the global financial architecture, and the landmark decision in Egypt last year to establish the Lost and Damaged Fund has helped catapult finance for nature and climate to the top of the international agenda. Just 8 months after the GBF was approved, the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund was launched. Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany have already contributed to the fund, enough to operationalize the fund, but still far from where we need to be. This December, parties will meet in Dubai to complete the first ever global stocktake and mandated by the Paris Agreement to assess their progress. Today, we can do a mini stocktake of our own with respect to the progress we have made since COP15 and what we need to do to build a nature-positive world. Hit our 30 by 30 target to protect 30% of the earth, land, and sea by 2030, and mobilize at least $200 billion per year by 2030 to save the planet we love and rely on. That's why I have put together a panel of leading voices from around the world to discuss this critical issue. Today, we will be hearing from Aileen, Carlos Manuel Rodríguez, and Rashid Sumaila on their experience, knowledge, and ideas for how we can work together to continue to drum up support for biodiversity financing. We will start off by hearing from Aileen. Aileen is the Chief Program Officer at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, where she oversees the foundation's core grant-making programs. She has over 20 years of experience with the organization, overseeing its environmental conservation program at what is now the Conservation and Markets Initiative. She also served as the program director of the foundation's first initiative focused on protecting wild salmon ecosystems. So we are eager to hear from her today on how the philanthropic sector is supporting biodiversity financing and conservation. So Aileen, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Carlos. It feels really appropriate, actually, to be having this conversation with you, because I think I last saw you in person for the closing of Herencia, Colombia, which was probably a great example of how philanthropic capital and public capital, at least, could partner together to really deliver resources for conservation at a large scale. And I think it's maybe just a taste of what we have to do better in order to achieve our aspirations around this. So first, I'd like to also thank CI for convening this conversation. I think as you were describing, in some ways, we can all be proud that we came out of the Kunming-Montreal COP with, I think, an ambitious set of targets. And yet, at the same time, I think we all know that it was made on the promise of a large-scale resource mobilization that is got to really be this community's priority for the next many years. And I think that is clearly going to require new kinds of partnerships across different types of capital. I think we hear the old trope that basically the goal is for philanthropy to mobilize millions so that the public sector can mobilize billions and the private sector can mobilize trillions. And that's the aspiration. But I think in reality, we aren't quite there yet. And I think all of us have to find new ways to work together in order to get to that aspiration. So I think for philanthropy, I think it's our job to serve as risk capital that can drive innovation, that can hopefully create new models for delivering solutions. I think it's our job to think about capacity building and really creating the, last mile that gets dollars to the ground in a more efficient, effective, and community-driven way. I think we really need to focus on some of the infrastructure pieces, whether that is the things that are about transparency and really being able to measure our results and be able to provide those mechanisms that bring the funding together in new ways. And I think most importantly for philanthropy, I think we're focused on thinking about how we can bridge and connect across sectors. I think as we did the run up to this discussion, you asked us, or you asked me basically to think about blended finance, right? And what that could do for us here. I think the promise of blended finance, again, is that it can allow for large scale capital mobilization. But the reality is that up until now, in some ways, we've only been skating across the surface, right? We've been, in some respects, cherry picking the best deals. We've had some innovation, but not maybe enough ability to scale. And we've had pipeline problems. It hasn't been able to come together in a large way. And we haven't really been able to deliver both, I think, the additionality that we need, as well as maybe to tap into solutions on the ground in a more powerful way. So from my perspective, I think it's really going to be important for philanthropy to be able to work across sectors with all of you to be able to do this. I think maybe the other thing I want to acknowledge about this moment is the reality is that we are in a moment where as important as it is for capital to be able to step up, let's just acknowledge that there are a lot of pressures on public sector funding that are making it harder to deliver in this moment, right? Whether that is Ukraine or other crises that we're still recovering with relative to COVID. I think the first step that I want to applaud is what has been mobilized for the Global Environment Facility's new fund. But the reality is that we are going to need a lot more of capital from all sectors if we're going to make this work. And I think in many respects, what I'm focused on certainly for the near term is what are the partnerships that are going to allow us to demonstrate the promise of mobilizing more capital so that everybody can collectively step up and really deliver capital on the scale that's going to be needed for this ambition. And really glad to have this conversation because I think those partnerships are going to be absolutely necessary.
Thank you very much, Aileen. I remember perfectly that day that I saw you when we signed the Herencia Colombia program that it was, it was hard to build, but we finally did it. Thank you very much for your support. And we will now hear from Carlos Manuel Rodríguez. Carlos Manuel was selected as CEO and chairperson of the Global Environment Facility in June 2020. Carlos Manuel has been a pioneer in the development of payment for ecosystem services and strategies for forest restoration, ocean conservation, and decarbonization of his home country of Costa Rica. During his three terms as an environment and energy minister, Costa Rica doubled the size of its forest, made its electric sector fully renewable, and consolidated a national park system that has made the Central American country a prime ecotourism destination. And well, Carlos Manuel has also founded and served on the board of several environmental NGOs and tropical research institutes. And after his second tenure as minister, he was vice president for global policy at Conservation International for almost 12 years. Carlos Manuel, welcome again. Could you please tell us about the development and approval of the Global Biodiversity Fund and what needs to happen between now and December when the fund will be active? Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. Carlos, thank you so much. And it is such a pleasure to be here with Rashid and Aileen. And as well as with you, Carlos, and very grateful with the invitation. So let me give a little bit of context so we can understand even much better what Aileen was explaining. I mean, the moment that we are right now. So the first thing that I want to say is that this GBF, Global Biodiversity Framework, is a second generation of global targets, having the first generation, which is were called the Aichi targets 2010-2020. And basically, the new framework is very similar to the previous one. But we have learned a lot. And we have learned that we didn't did much traction and impact with the first generation of global biodiversity targets because we were unable to do two things. One is mobilize financial resources from all sources more efficiently and avoid the north-south political confrontation on who is going to pay for the cost of protecting nature around the planet. That's one. And the second has to do with the fact that Aichi target number 3 is very similar to GBF target 18 that has to do with the negative and perverse incentives and subsidies. Both targets in the previous framework are the big challenges in the actual framework. And I think that this is where we need to concentrate. So that's one point. The second point is that we came out of Montreal extremely excited about the outcome. Yes, we should celebrate the outcome. But I think that many people tend to believe that we are beginning from zero in terms of mobilizing financial resources. The GEF, before COP15, has already allocated $2.2 billion for the CBD countries to implement the new framework. So I want to highlight that the GEF is today by far the largest financial partner of the CBD countries in terms of the implementation of the new framework, and that the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund is a complement to what the GEF core funding does, the GEF Trust Fund does. As a matter of fact, we just approved $650 million in June on projects to more than 45 countries that presented initiatives to implement the new framework. So the second point is that the GEF is already heavily investing in the implementation of the new framework, as many other organizations are just beginning to understand what are the roles and responsibilities and how to mobilize resources. The GEF is already investing. The new fund, which was a decision taken by parties, is a complement to what the GEF biodiversity focal area has projected and programmed in GEF 8. And in this respect, I think that the new facility has a lot of very interesting things. One is that 20% of the projects of these new funds should be relevant to indigenous people and local communities. That's a very important element. The second element is that the project cycle to access these resources will be shortened up to probably in half, which will facilitate the access to these resources. There's been a challenge with regards to access to finance on the view of recipient countries. The only way that access can be accelerated can be in building better capacities at the country level. So this is the context, Carlos, on where we are from the GEF perspective. And the new fund, as you mentioned, has been established in a record time. In less than 8 months out of the COP, the fund was established. And the establishment was not an administrative paper compliance process. It was a heavy political negotiation as well, very similar to what we saw in COP. It happened in the context of the GEF governing body, which is the GEF Council. And well, countries agree on the structure, the governance of the new fund, as well as the programming of the new fund, how the funds should be distributed. And there's a decision taken by countries. Of course, this is a biodiversity fund. The biodiversity fund should invest in biodiversity-rich areas around the world, in the ocean and in the countries. And the role of mega biodiverse countries are extremely, extremely important. Nevertheless, 36% of the resources of this new fund should go to less developed countries and small island states. We needed in this year, Carlos, to have in this new fund $200 million. That is a World Bank requirement for the establishment of the trust fund. It was so important at the same time that the GEF Council and the GEF Assembly took the decision on the establishment of the fund, that we were able to bring at least $200 million so the trust fund can be established. The first council meeting of the new biodiversity fund will happen in February. Well, once more, I believe that you can measure this with whatever standard. And I think that the work that the countries has done is fabulous, because in a matter of a year, the fund will be taking the first decisions in terms of programming. The first disbursement of this new fund will happen in June 2024. By June 2024, we expect to have $500 million. And what we aim to have in this fund is around $2 billion. That complements what the GEF is doing. My final point here as an introduction to this very interesting webinar, Carlos, is the following. The success of implementing the new framework has little to do with mobilizing more resources, and a lot has to do with defunding the investments that destroy nature. And this is the biggest challenges. And I'm talking target 18. Target 18, we need to deal with subsidies in the fishery sector. We need to deal with incentives in the land use sector. We need to deal with subsidies in agriculture. We need to internalize all negative externalities and recognize the positive externalities that are being generated by proper, good, sound management of the land and the ocean. So the gap is $700 million. That gap can be narrowed by if out of those 700, if today humans are investing in many different sectors up to $500 billion in activities that are harmful to biodiversity, the idea is to repurpose that. And with that, we need to mobilize $200 billion. That is why the goal in Target 19 in CBD is that we should be mobilizing $200 billion by 2030. So this is the math. Now, the political reality is another different story. We've been dealing with, subsidies in the oil and gas, fishing, and agricultural sector for 2 or 3 decades with little progress. This is the challenge we have in front of us, Carlos. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carlos Manuel. It's amazing to hear that just after 8 months after the COP15, we already have this fund. So that's a very good achievement that you have. Congratulations. And I know that also how much you care about these subsidies and things that we will be talking a little bit later. So let's hear from my colleague, Dr. Rashid Sumaila. Dr. Rashid is a University Killam professor at the University of British Columbia, or UBC, in Canada, and the director of the Fisheries Economic Research Unit at the UBC Institute for Oceans and Fisheries. Early this year, he was the co-recipient of the 2023 Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement, an award for an environmental science, environmental health, and energy. He will be speaking with us today on the role of the blue economy in achieving and financing the Global Biodiversity Framework. So thank you very much, Rashid. The floor is yours.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this panel. It's always a pleasure to work with Carlos, whom I've worked with on a high-level panel on financing biodiversity years ago. So it's really wonderful to be with you, Aileen. We've done things together, and so this is wonderful. Thank you so much. The blue economy is large. It's very important. But so far, I don't think the world has really taken the blue economy as seriously as it needs to take it, mainly because we live on land. So most of us concentrate on the land. But the ocean is large, for example, and it's only part of the blue economy. You have all the inland waters, the lakes and the rivers. We all know their transportation. They do a lot of things for us. So it is large and important, and we need to really take it seriously, work hard to ensure that it is sustainably used so that we can continue to benefit from all the things that we get from our aquatic systems from the ocean. So just to give you some numbers, there's a paper that actually made a calculation and came to the conclusion that if the ocean was a nation, was a country, it will be the largest economy in the world. So that's one thing to remember, the largest economy in the world. And the OECD has actually estimated and projected that by 2030, the ocean economy, I think this is only the ocean part of the blue economy, would be up to $3 trillion a year in terms of contribution to the global economy. So that's a number to also keep in mind. And what I'm going to do now is to say, imagine this $3 trillion, if it was a country, on average, according to the OECD, the tax rate on average globally is 26%. So the thing is, if we were to use, I'm not going to ask for 26% because, okay, the ocean is part of the larger economy. If we were brave enough to make sure that 10% of the $3 trillion goes to the blue economy, to the ocean, to the biodiversity of the ocean, that will almost immediately make available $300 billion, right? That is more than the $200 billion we are talking about. Okay, so I'll say, okay, I want to be a bit more cautionary and say, how about just 5%? If we take 5% of that, we have 150 billion, if my calculations are right. I think they are right. So there you go. So there is a lot. And how do you get hold of this? The blue economy is doing valuable things. And how do I define the blue economy? To me, any activity that is on the ocean, below the ocean, adjacent to the ocean, or to our inland waters is part of the blue economy, right? So that is a big definition, and this is valuable. What do we do with valuable things? People pay levies, they pay fees, they pay for licenses, they pay taxes. So there are so many ways. In fisheries, for example, we hardly tax anybody, right? So there's a lot of potential there to make this to get the money to ensure that we have a sustainable blue economy, what I will call infinity blue economy, that continues to support us and to feed us. Remember, these GDP numbers are not even including things like carbon sequestration, the oxygen value, all the great stuff that the ocean does for us. So, but to be able to achieve the infinity biodiversity, ocean biodiversity, I think we need to be really careful how we develop the blue economy, right? Because my worry is that there's so much optimism, we may end up actually messing up the ocean even more. So it needs care. And we need resources to do this, right? This is where the funding comes in. So later we can talk more, but this I thought was my opener. There's a lot of value in there, and there's potential to actually get resources in addition to those mentioned by Carlos and Aileen earlier, right? We have the private sector, but we'll build the story as we go. So this is my opening statement, and let's get going. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Rashid. And we were just talking just before the beginning of the webinar about mangroves, and you know, it has to do a lot with what you are saying too. Thank you for your amazing insights. Now, let's open up our panel to continue our discussion with Aileen, Rashid, and Carlos Manuel on financing and nature positive world. You know, I like to kick off our panel discussion with a question for Aileen, with her perspective on the catalytic potential of blended finance. You know, I feel like everyone is talking about financing, but blended finance is an issue. So how can the public, and you said something just before, Aileen, how can the public, private, and philanthropic sectors work together to meet our 2030 biodiversity and climate targets? You just talked about that at the beginning, but if you can just tell us some more about the how can we do, how can we work together to meet that 2030 targets?
Yeah, thank you for that, Carlos. I think, you know, I think as I mentioned before, right, some of the things that philanthropy can do in these blended finance equations is really to de-risk, right, the innovations that need to happen. So for example, the foundation has gotten involved in providing the technical assistance that allows new mechanisms like sustainability linked loans and bonds, and other similar mechanisms to be able to deliver. I think that we can invest in capacity. I think we all know that one of the challenges with some of these blended financing mechanisms to date is that they often can focus on the places where there happens to be market capacity, and they can focus on the problems that are the most ripe and ready, but not necessarily the ones that are the priorities of communities or countries. And I think philanthropy plays a pretty critical role in working with the public sector and the private sector to make sure that the capacity is there where the projects and the pipeline is the most needed. I think from our standpoint, some of the kind of infrastructure that's required to move more deals is also an area where we can work together. We have started to take a look at the role that philanthropic capital can play, for example, in guarantees that allow the public sector and the private sector to use its balance sheet differently in terms of facilitating these kind of blended capital solutions. And I think finally, we can support some of these stakeholder processes that bring people together around connecting the dots. So for example, around the Glasgow Pledge, I think many of you have been involved with the Forest Climate Leaders investment packages at the country level, right, which really attempt to, I think, provide a framework for connecting the dots across blended capital solutions and making sure that they're delivering what the countries are really needing and asking for. And I think, again, we can play a role in supporting those types of solutions.
Well, thank you very much, Aileen. Now, I would like to ask Carlos Manuel, how the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund will be. I was just listening to Aileen, and I just realized, how can the GBF fund will be a true game changer and differentiate itself from existing multilateral funds. You just talk about, about 2.0 fund, like a new fund, like a new way to do things. So how can the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund will be a true game changer, Carlos Manuel?
Well, it will be a game changer in multiple aspects. One important is the complement to what the JEF does. And let me tell you a little bit about what the JEF has been doing lately, because this is very interesting, because we've been, providing funding to countries for 30 years, but it's not until very recently that we have this more integrated approach where we don't work anymore on designing projects for the Biodiversity Convention, projects for international waters, projects for climate change, land degradation, and chemicals. Now, we allow the countries full flexibility to use their resources in an integrated manner. And this is where evidently nature-based solution becomes a way by which countries can utilize the JEF resources. Looking at the Climate Convention, at the Land Degradation Convention, and Biodiversity Convention, the Rio Conventions in an integrated manner. So we're going towards more integration. The GBFF fund is a complement to what the JEF has been doing. And the JEF will, through the JEF Trust Fund, provide the funding to countries to implement in a coherent, comprehensive manner the new framework. The new fund will give added value on various, and these are the decisions not from the JEF Secretariat, these are decisions from the countries within the JEF Council meeting and at the JEF Assembly, which is one that the game changer will be as we understand how the new fund can unlock resources from all sources, particularly in the use of more effective resources at the country level. 80% of what humans are investing in nature conservation are public expenditures. This is what Germany invests in Germany. This is what Colombia invests in Colombia, 80%. The rest is a combination of ODA and private sectors. We can double. That means that the JEF can be twice the size it is. That will never move the needle. The needle may be moved in a combination of maximizing the impact of those resources that are invested at the country level, as at the same time that we address those policies that contribute to the loss of biodiversity. So that's one point. The second point that the new fund will be working with is with Target 18 that has to do with perverse incentives. Once more, for me, the success of the new framework has to do much more with Target 18 than Target 19. Target 18 talks about perverse incentives. Target 19 talks about mobilizing resources. And this is where this fund will be working. Additionally to this fund will provide strategic funding to indigenous people in local communities. And by the way, the JEF has been historically the organization that financially support the biggest to indigenous communities. And we got a very interesting experience in terms of access to finance to indigenous groups. I mean, if we have challenges with national governments, you can only imagine what it means to work with indigenous communities in remote parts of planet Earth, whereby access to finance is an important issue. So access to finance and the governance decision-making on finance for indigenous people is very interesting. In the JEF, we got the indigenous leaders in the board of the Inclusive Conservation Initiative, which is a $25 million fund for indigenous people and nature conservation. So the GEF is breaking ground in terms of generating experiences and how to work hand in hand with indigenous community. That's an additional element that the new fund will increase. And the third, fourth, and fifth elements are how do we plan to work with philanthropic organizations? How do we plan to work with multilateral banks? Aileen has been very clear on, the role of philanthropic organization. Initially, many countries in CBD thought that the new fund would be extremely attractive to philanthropic organization. Philanthropic organization will never. I don't see them putting resources in the GEF because we had this unwritten agreement, the GEF and philanthropic organization that the GEF, we work with central governments, philanthropic organizations mainly work with civil society under the same global objectives, and we complement very well. What we have proven to do very good, the GEF and philanthropic organization, is to create specific funds. The Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, the Blue Nature Alliance, and Enduring Earth are very good examples of how the GEF has been working with philanthropic organizations, creating specific initiatives and funds that can mobilize resources and can leverage resources. So this is something that we plan to expand with the new facility. We will be, the GEF Secretariat, presenting ideas to the GBFF Council, ideas on how we can set aside resources so we can do some leveraging with the philanthropic organization. And the final point with multilateral development banks, we talk a lot about how do we unlock resources from the banks. There are many ways, but we got a very, very clear political challenge, dear Carlos, Rashid, and Aileen, which is the fact that blended finance means death. Accessing to World Bank money means death. Blended finance means death. And countries, recipient countries, are in a debt crisis. So how are we going to present a compelling financial case for developing countries? And I'm thinking less developed countries, African nations, small island development states that are really struggling with the debt issue. How are we going to come up with this idea of blended finance if this means more debt? So we need to understand that element more clearly in the conversation of the establishment of the new funds. Less developed nations, small island development states were very clear that death is not an option for them to access to biodiversity resources. So we had a very clear political challenge here. A very different story is with the large emerging economies, the Brazils, the Chinas, and Indias, or the OECD nations that are GEF recipient monies, like Colombia, Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Chile. I mean, in these countries, the banks can go to the ministers of finance and tell them, we got money for infrastructure, but we got money, cheaper money, to invest in the sustainable management of protected areas. The GEF money can make the loans cheaper. So in those middle income nations, we see that blended finance can be an option, not the case of less developed countries and small island states. So these are some key elements that we've been discussing in the preparation and establishment of the new fund, and this is what the new fund should be doing. The new fund will complement, because that was the mandate that we received from the COP, we complement what the GEF Trust Fund does on biodiversity and climate change.
Well, thank you very much, Carlos Manuel. You've been very clear answering the question. You know, we will be just discussing some more later about this. And I would love to hear from Dr. Rashid about the innovative schemes listed in Target 19. Carlos Manuel has been talking about Target 19. Aileen has talked about Target 19. So what do you think, Rashid? You know, the Global Biodiversity Framework that will contribute to mobilizing $200 billion by 2030. Such as payment for ecosystem services, green bonds, and biodiversity offsets and credits. How can these types of innovative financial mechanisms help us transition to a sustainable blue economy? You just started talking about that, but just tell me how can it help us in the transition?
Yeah, thank you again for giving me the floor. And Target 19 is actually talking about finance, which is what we're talking about here. And it's a very important part of the whole Global Biodiversity Framework, because as we all know, you can have the best ideas in the world. If you don't have funding, no finance, that's the graveyard of good intentions. So we need this funding scheme. So I'm really happy it's been given a lot of emphasis. Among the 23 targets, finance has the most paragraphs, actually. It has about 8, the target 19. And I think the next one has 4 paragraphs. If the volume alone is telling you something, there was a lot of thinking around this, and I like it. Number 1 is very comprehensive. There is call on domestic funding, national funding, and international funding. And this is where, Carlos, your point, and Aileen, what you said, there is also call for foundation and philanthropic funding. There is a call for private sources and public sources. So it's kind of really beautifully done in that sense. And why do I say this? If you look at the investment needs, and this is something we discussed in the report we did on ocean finance for the high-level panel for sustainable blue economies, which has 15 heads of states in there. So 19 of us from all over the world, very diverse group, wrote this. One of the things we did was to say, what are the investment needs for the ocean or for the blue economy? And we divided these into 3, right? In terms of their potential return, right? So if you look at the blue economy, there are activities that can be competitive in the market. They can give you competitive returns. And this is where the private sector is good at, right? They will do it. Some agriculture businesses may give you the return, or some fishing, some recreational fishing, all that. So, and those are easy because the market can deal with that. Then you have the second level where you get some return, but usually below market return. They give you more value than what the market really assigns to them. And this is where you need public-private partnership to deal with, right? You need blended finance. You need something from the philanthropic organizations to help this work. So that is good. That's why the comprehensiveness is important. And then you have services, maybe like carbon sequestration, which at the moment, we don't really know how to deal with this in the market. We know it's valuable, but there are no returns. These are the places where you need the public to step in, right? And so the ability to know this different investment is important. And that's why we need everybody to be on board. And if you layer this on the point, Carlos, you make so strongly about the less developed countries, you also have to think about that, like you did. There are countries that can go into the market and maybe be supported a bit by philanthropy or public sources to get there. But there are countries that cannot just do that. And they are part of our global system. You know, I like to say that fish don't need visa to go anywhere, right? Fish go where they go. Microplastic, it doesn't care where it starts, right? So we have to think globally. And so we need to support these countries to really come up to the level we need to sustain our blue economy and our ocean. When I talk like in the African Development Bank, I told them, look, Africa, you have to put your money where your mouth is. You have to invest in research. You have to understand your blue economy. Otherwise, you don't get the most out of it. So we need the national and domestic. And then I go to the European Union, for example, or the Canadian Parliament, I say, look here, you guys, you have a responsibility to support these countries because of the history, all that has happened with Africa and Europe and everybody. So you have that moral responsibility to contribute. So we need to have this thinking. And I think the GEF program, is part of the rationale for having it. So this is great as it looks, and we need to think hard about all these things. Other things I like about this target 19, capacity building has come up again and again. To really achieve our goals, we need more capacity, we need more innovation. And there are people who are talking about the vehicles you mentioned, Carlos. I've seen some examples. There is a group in Singapore, headquartered in Singapore. There's this lady, what's her name? She's one of our authors. And what they do blended finance, mainly to support female economic activities in the blue ocean. So you see, it's inclusive, it opens up the place, it takes care of gender and people who cannot normally get access to capital. So this gives us room to do very creative things. I dream of something like having ways to get into communities in, say, Africa and get all these young people. Africa has the youngest population in the world today. How do we give them the tools they need to really work, invest sustainably into our blue economy and turn things, get them jobs and livelihoods in a sustainable manner? And I think at target 19 is very good for this. And these young people can really do all the green bonding, the credit offsets, and so on in very clever ways with technology and new information. So all in all, it's a great target. We need it for all that we are doing to work. We need the money, we need the finance. And so I love the emphasis. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rashid. It's been an amazing conversation, and fish definitely don't need visa to go through the corridors. Yeah, definitely. So we need everyone on this, and we need to work together, of course, as you just said. I've been wanting to hear from Aileen on what she thinks, are some of the key lessons learned from her experience leveraging philanthropic funding for biodiversity and climate financing efforts, and how those lessons could be applied to the capitalization of the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund. Can you provide us with some insights on this, please, Aileen?
Yeah, I guess I would say, so we are a part of the Protecting Our Planet Challenge, where some of the leading philanthropies that are involved in supporting nature came together really around the promise of the Global Biodiversity Framework to make a $5 billion pledge. And I think what really motivated folks was recognizing that this is sort of an all hands moment where we need to reach deeper. And it really was framed in the notion of a challenge, in the sense that we are looking for partners who want to come together with that philanthropic capital and be able to deliver bigger. And for me, the lesson was, I think people recognize the importance of the moment, and certainly for every one of the philanthropies involved, there was a willingness to dig deeper in order to meet the moment. I think but in terms of delivering that money effectively, what we're really finding is it is about kind of the very, in many cases, regional partnerships, right, where we've come together to identify both the public sector and the private sector partners who can work together for deliver very specific solutions, as well as the vehicles that allow us to collaborate differently. And I think Carlos Manuel referenced some of these when he mentioned CEPF, Blue Nature Alliance, and Enduring Earth as models, right? I think for us, these are important delivery vehicles. I think the other lesson that, for me is maybe important in this is, what I'm taking from this conversation, right? And from our own experiences, the needs are so different at different layers, right? So Carlos Manuel has signaled the need for really dealing with the subsidies problem. And I think that for us is really going to be about stepping up the pieces that are willing to embrace a high degree of risk in going after the problem, right? Because as he mentioned, this is something we've been wrestling with as a community for a very long time. The fact that it's hard doesn't mean that we can shy away from it at this point. I think the other, important lesson here is when we think about, the blended finance opportunities, I think we have to focus them in the places where it's appropriate and where you actually can deliver, I think, as much additionality as you can without too much concessionality, right, in terms of being able to deliver it in the markets that it makes sense. And then finally, I think what Carlos Manuel said about, thinking about the countries where because of the debt crisis, this just isn't an option. I think the question of how we pull together to create fiscal space is also a really important one. And I think, some of the lessons that I'm seeing is, certainly from our philanthropic partners, there's a willingness to, sort of reach for those kinds of solutions in a way that we haven't seen before. Back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Aileen. I've been having so fun in this conversation, really a lot of things to learn, to analyze. We have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to do like 2-in-1 questions and then to do the close of the event, the closing. So, Carlos Manuel, I'm so eager to hear your perspective while we are on this topic. The Global Biodiversity Framework Fund is set to leverage funds from the public, private, and philanthropic sectors. Rashid just said that we need to work all together. So why is it key that we use an all-hands-on-deck approach and how can the fund catalyze private sector investment? Please.
Okay, thanks. First, let me say that I feel that in many sectors, biodiversity, political sectors, climate sectors, there's this wrong impression that the private sector is a potential new source of unrestricted finance for nature conservation. And the private sector is not philanthropic organization. Private sector are not funds, are not banks. They are not charity as well. Private sector will be where the money is. And if protecting nature doesn't generate money, private sector won't be there. The only way by which the private sector can do money out of protecting nature and doing their business is if governments understand their role. And the role of the government is to level the economic playing field. So we go from this unsustainable neoclassic economic model into this desired circular economic model. And for that, we need governments with clarity, with leadership. We need the champions in doing that. Otherwise, it will be extremely difficult. I think that the ultimate responsibility for governments are creating the frameworks and the incentives so 100% of public and private investments are aligned with the Paris Agreement and the GBFF. I see that as the ultimate goal. Of course, 80% of the economy is private sector, so private sector is a major player on this, but the private sector won't be doing what they need to do and what they want to do unless the governments deal with the market failure, the institutional failure, the lack of, the irrational national accounting systems and the way we define or measure growth and prosperity. I mean, it's a package, and we all know this. The challenge is, how do we do it? Where do we begin? What are the catalyzer investments? And we don't have all answers. As a matter of fact, the GEF is thinking on organizing an international conference on Target 18. So we can bring the experts. We want to do this next year as a contribution to countries on understanding how we approach the very challenging and politically sensitive issue of Target 18 that has to do with the perverse incentives and subsidies. So we want to generate an understanding on what does this mean. And this is very different to what we have done in the biodiversity sector for decades. It's very different than creating a protected area or creating a corridor or saving a species from extinction. This is way more complex, and the GEF needs a whole of a society approach. the Jeff has a major responsibility, whole of government approach. You know, in the Jeff, Carlos, we said that we work with countries, but that is not true. We don't work with countries. We work with one agency in the executive branch, the Ministries of Environment. This is where we work the Jeff in 144 countries. We'll never achieve what Aileen and Rashid indicate we need to do if the Jeff only works with the Ministries of Environment. We need to work in a comprehensive manner. And in Jeff 9, we'll be making proposals so countries can bring projects to the Jeff that are being socialized with the Ministries of Finance, Agriculture, and Planning. The operational focal point of the Jeff will change from being a person in the Ministry of Environment into having a steering committee that reflects the priorities, the climate priorities of finance, planning, agriculture, and fisheries and nature conservation. So these are things that we're planning to do. And again, the ultimate goal, Carlos, is to help countries create the incentives and the framework so all public and private investments are 100% aligned with the Paris Agreement, the GBFF. That is what, this is the condition that the private sector needs. And with that, I think that we'll be in path to nature positiveness.
Thank you very much, Carlos Manuel. They're telling me that we are almost out of time, so we have 4 minutes. I'm going to do, the last question, a very brief, in 1 minute, Rashid. Let's move back to our discussion on the blue economy for a minute. How do we reach the 30 by 30 goal of conserving 30% of our terrestrial and marine habitat by 2030 while protecting the livelihoods of small scale fisheries? So what do you think?
You don't hear me because I was muted. Yeah. So very quickly, number one, the 30% protection comes from science. This is a comprehensive review of all that scientists have said, and we came with that number. So it didn't come from no place. There is backing. Number two, actually 30 by 30 is good business. A large group of us across the globe did an analysis, and our finding is that if you put in $1 to protect your ocean and land, you get $5 back. So it's good business. That's the second thing we need to let people know. Now, the big point you make is a livelihood and small scale and communities. We have to find innovative ways to keep their livelihoods going, because that's important. We don't want anyone to starve. No. So we have to think outside the box. And a number of ways. Number one is the subsidies that has come up again and again. We have a paper, me and my group now be under review, where we calculated if we were to take away the harmful subsidies in developing countries, coastal countries, and use that to provide people the basic income to need for livelihood, how will that go? And in many cases, that will cover 80% of their needs, right? The harmful subsidies. So you win-win, you release the pressure on nature and you give them their livelihood, and we get to a better place. So that's one thing. Another thing is to leverage all the funding that are being talked about, climate funds. You have the subsidies agreement has some funding in it, and you have the High Seas Treaty has some funding combined with this one we're talking about, and to find a way to let these monies reach the communities in their villages, in their communities. So, because that's not a given, right? You can have the funds and they just get whittled away. How do we make sure the money is getting? This is occupying my mind a lot now. I'm designing a project to help choose some locations in Africa to start with and really say, how do we get the money to help you adapt to climate change, protect biodiversity and your livelihoods at the same time? And the day we get to do that, I will retire. Okay, my friends, thank you so much. And time is running out.
Well, thank you, Rashid, very much. I have so many questions and so many notes that I'm taking. I think we will have to have another webinar about subsidies, because I think it's very important. I've talked a lot about this with Carlos Manuel too. And I think we need to involve more ministers, not only environmental ministers, but also finance, agriculture, and we need to have a conversation all together. So We're
And
running out of time.
equity and inclusiveness. You know, the fishery subsidies disadvantages women and young people and destroys the environment. Just crazy stuff, right? Now we need to talk about and find a way to deal with. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Rashid, and thank you, Aileen, Carlos Manuel, Rashid, all the more than 200 people that have been connected in the webinar. Some key takeaways. Aileen, you provided some great insight as to know Philanthropic can provide the risk capital to drive innovation. It's fascinating to hear about you building partnerships across the public, private, and philanthropic sectors can be key towards scaling up blended finance efforts. As you mentioned, we are only scratching the surface of the potential for blended finance. Carlos Manuel, it's fascinating to hear how the GBF fund was established in record time that required extensive political negotiations on determining the structure and governance of new fund on the new fund. We are excited to hear about the amazing progress you are making toward building the structure that will help us reach the 200 billion goal while not taking our eye off the target 18. And Rashid, I really appreciate you reminding us of the importance of putting the blue economy front and center in the discussions around finance for nature. While it's important to think of the ocean as more than just a financial figure. It's fascinating to know that the blue economy is bigger than the economies of China, the United States, or any other nation. So thank you very much for being here today. I appreciate it. And I hope that all those people that were connected have enjoyed these conversations as much as we did. Thank you very much and see you soon.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody. Yeah.
Muchas gracias. Chao.
Muchas gracias.
Ciao.
Take care.